To understand Mideast newspaper headlines, you have to know about the background, the foundation, which the headlines are based upon. What are these headlines about? They're about the Palestinians, Israel, Iraq. To understand Israel, you have to know something about the Holocaust. That's essential for understanding Israel and the special relationship Israel has with the United States. We could learn about the Holocaust through TV shows, books, newspapers. But look at the quality of the newspaper. Here's a Mideast headline in the San Francisco Chronicle: Israel storms Arafat headquarters. But with so many important things happening in the world, look what the editor chose for the top story of the day. A cheesy humor piece. Son puts mom up for sale on eBay. So let's not use newspapers or TV programs. Instead, let's learn about the Holocaust by getting a book written by a professor. The standard work on the Holocaust is The Destruction of the European Jews by Professor Raoul Hilberg. It comes in 3 volumes. To the right is the condensed version for students. We'll be using the 3-volume version, published in 1985. Here's Raoul Hilberg from the movie Shoah, directed by Claude Lanzmann.
In all of my work, I have never begun by asking the big questions because I was always afraid that I would come up with small answers, and I have preferred, therefore, to address these things which are minutiae or detail in order that I might then be able to put together in a gestalt a picture which, if not an explanation, is at least a description, a more full description of what transpired.
On page 1219, there is a table showing the number of deaths broken down into categories. Hilberg put the total Holocaust deaths at 5.1 million. I know you've heard the 6 million number, but Hilberg, having researched the subject for 40 years at the time the book came out, arrived at an estimate of 5.1 million. Hilberg gives a breakdown of the deaths that occurred at the camps. Here we can see that 1 million deaths occurred at Auschwitz. The next 3 camps, Treblinka, Belzec, and Sobibor, are thought of as their own separate category because they were run so similarly. They are sometimes called the Operation Reinhardt death camps. Together they equal more deaths than Auschwitz, 1.5 million. These 3 camps equal a little under 1/3 of the Holocaust, and it's these 3 camps that we're going to be looking at for the rest of this video. The Operation Reinhardt death camps worked like this. Jews were ordered onto trains. Some were told they were being shipped east, where they would find work. At a point in the journey, they were told that everyone needed to get off at the next stop to transfer to a different train. And due to a typhus epidemic spread by lice, they would also shower and be deloused here. The passengers would step out of the train into a narrow passageway between the train and this building right here and walk to the left. There were fake signs to make them think they were at a real train station. That white thing there at the end of the building is actually this sign here. Notice the people on the left who have just passed the corner of the building. You'll be able to see them in the distance in the next image. They would gather in a group in this area and then be led through this gate where you see the red arrow. That same gate is in the lower right of this aerial photo. The men would go to their right and the women into the building on their left, where they would check in their belongings and strip naked for what they were told would be a shower. The men would walk in this direction to join the women at the entrance to a dirt path known as the tube, a path that led to the gas chamber. This red arrow here is in the same place as this red pointer in this aerial view. Entering this path, they'd walk down here, the path taking them around these trees to the entrance of the diesel gas chambers. Sobibor, Belzec, and Treblinka were all run like this. Let's look at a map rather than a model. The main train track line was right here. The train to Treblinka would pull in onto these rails, and the people would get out right here. They would walk along here. That sign I pointed out would have been about right here on the map. So they'd come into this area, this courtyard, and then they would walk through this gate in the fence. The men would come over here, checking their belongings and strip naked. And the women would go over here and check in their belongings and strip naked. Then they would enter what was called the tube right here. This was the pathway to the gas chamber. Here's a model of the Belzec gas chamber sitting on a wood table. Inside there are 6 chambers, each about the size of a small bedroom. Here's one of the 6. You can see a man inside working on removing the dead bodies. A hallway runs down the middle. A room in the very back contained a diesel engine which pumped exhaust into the rooms. You can see the door of that room here. From this view you can see when the gassing was finished, these doors opened upward, similar to garage doors. Here is one of the doors still closed. Notice the wood plank holding it shut. This one is just being opened and you can barely see the bodies spilling out, and this one is completely open. The bodies were then taken out and thrown into large pits and covered over with dirt when the pits were full. Let's look at a map rather than a model for a moment. We can see the path to the gas chamber. Here's the gas chamber. And here's all the pits where at Treblinka alone an estimated 700,000 bodies were buried. When the killing operation was nearly finished and the bodies lie decaying in mass graves, Heinrich Himmler ordered the camps to dig up the bodies and cremate them. The reason for this was that Germany was losing the war, and this territory in Poland would be taken over by the Soviets. Himmler didn't want the Soviets to find the mass graves. So at the 3 camps, 1.3 million bodies were dug up. During the very end of the killing operations, the bodies were taken directly to the cremation grills. To summarize what we've just learned, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec were all run in the same way. At Treblinka alone, an estimated 700,000 were gassed, buried. Later they were dug up and then cremated. 50,000 were gassed and then taken directly to be cremated, for a total of 750,000. At all 3 camps, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec, an estimated 1.3 million were gassed, buried, dug up, then cremated, with an estimated 200,000 gassed and then cremated. Total deaths were 1.5 million, nearly 1/3 of the whole Holocaust. At the bottom of most every page in Hilberg there are sources or footnotes. They are in text slightly smaller than the book's text. It's what Hilberg read in order to then write his book. What would happen if we looked at some of these sources? We're going to look at number 63. Yankel Wiernik is the author, and his book is called 1 Year in Treblinka. Where can we find this book? Amazon.com doesn't have it. Neither does San Francisco Public Library or San Francisco State University Library. Here on Amazon, no one has ever even reviewed it. It turns out a copy does exist at the University of California at Berkeley. It says, an inmate who escaped tells the day-to-day facts of 1 year of his torturous experience. So finally we get to hear about the Holocaust from someone who was really there. Most Jews who arrived at Treblinka died within the hour. However, a certain number were forced to live there and help with the killing operations. Wiernik was one of those until he escaped. Let's see what it says about the process of burning the bodies. Wiernik writes, Again, the corpses of oldsters, children, women, and men were exhumed. Whenever a grave was opened, a terrible stench polluted the air, as the bodies were in an advanced stage of putrefaction. It turned out that women burned easier than men. Accordingly, corpses of women were used for kindling the fires. But wait a minute, that sounds odd. Does Wiernik actually believe that women burn on their own? Like wood? That was page 28, but here on page 29 he essentially says as much. They had to pile the corpses on the grating and set them on fire. 3,000 corpses recently alive burning all at once. But here at a given signal they set the giant torch on fire and it burned with a huge flame. There's no wood mentioned, there's piles of bodies. He's saying that the bodies themselves burned like a giant torch. And on page 39 he writes, once the Germans threw some burning object into an open grave to see what would happen. Clouds of black smoke began to pour out at once, and the fire that started glimmered all day long. In other words, the bodies underground ignited. On the very last page, he writes about his escape. He was shot in the shoulder by a Ukrainian guard at close distance. Regarding the bullet, he writes, believe it or not, the bullet did not wound me. It went through all of my clothing and stopped at my shoulder, leaving a mark. He killed the guard with an axe, by the way. Back on page 29, there is a description of the Germans as they burned bodies. Ask yourself if it looks like propaganda or a real eyewitness account. The Germans stood around with satanic smiles on their faces, radiating satisfaction over their foul deeds. They drank toasts with choice liquors, ate, caroused, and enjoyed themselves near the warm fire. Seems a little over the top, doesn't it? Could German soldiers drink while on duty? Could you imagine having an appetite if you were surrounded by thousands of pounds of rotting flesh? Imagine what it would have smelled like there. Would the Germans have really had that demeanor? He later writes, the German fiends stood warming themselves, drinking, eating, and singing. At last the fires died down, leaving nothing but ashes. He seems to forget that they'd also leave bones. But anyway. Wiernik's vilifying portrayals weren't restricted only to the Nazis. Of a Jewish inmate, he writes on page 37, another such poor wretch was the so-called privy pit boss, Scheissmeister. He was dressed like a cantor and even had to grow a pointed beard. He wore a large alarm clock on a string around his neck. As no one was permitted to remain in the privy pit longer than 3 minutes, it was his duty to time everyone entering it. The name of this poor wretch was Julian. He also came from Czestochowa, where he had been the owner of a metal products factory. Would the German soldiers really have done something this ridiculously theatrical? And owner of a metal products factory. Consider. This book was published by the American representation of the General Jewish Workers' Union of Poland. And on page 12, Wiernik writes, I am a carpenter by trade, but for many years I functioned as a member of the examining board of the Warsaw Trades Chamber. So Wiernik had apparently worked for a union, and this book was published by a union. It's likely that the hapless Julian in real life was an infamous factory owner who had had a dispute with the union, and was thus portrayed this way in the book. It's clear that this 46-page book, A Year in Treblinka, is a fraud. But how could Wiernik have made the mistakes he made? In other words, why couldn't he lie very well? How could somebody not know that bodies don't burn on their own, that bullets that penetrate the clothing aren't likely to stop at the skin? For one, Wiernik was born long ago, 1891. At that time, Poland might not have been as modernized as Germany, the United States, or England. Then there's Polish Yiddish culture. Perhaps it wasn't in some ways as modernized as, say, German Yiddish culture. Perhaps it was very urban, and thus Wiernik didn't know a lot about the country. So we went into the foundations of the Treblinka death camp story by looking up a source in Raoul Hilberg's The Destruction of the European Jews, and we found Yankel Wiernik's book, A Year in Treblinka, but it turned out to be a fraud. Hilberg cites it as a source 5 times, by the way. But maybe other Holocaust scholars are more discerning. Let's take Yitzhak Arad. He was the head of Israel's Holocaust Museum, which is called Yad Vashem. This position is likely the most important Holocaust position in the world. He wrote a book called Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, the Operation Reinhard death camps. In addition, he was also a brigadier general in the Israeli army, so he would know about guns, fires, etc. So would he use Wiernik's book as a source? The answer is yes. Not only does he use Wiernik's book as a source, but mentions him by name on 24 pages. Arad puts his sources in the back of the book instead of at the bottom of each page like Hilberg. Here is just a single page of his sources. Wiernik, 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 Wiernik. Wiernik, 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 and Wiernik.